The fishermen and the bones whispers beneath the waves. It began as an ordinary day on the North Sea. Gray skies hung low over the water, and the air smelled of salt and diesel. Waves slapped against the hull as a small trawler crew dragged its heavy nets through the cold, murky depths. These men had worked these waters for years. Strong hands, weathered faces, and the kind of instincts that only come from living with the sea. But that morning something changed. The nets snagged on something deep. At first, the crew thought it was debris, maybe a rusted anchor, an old wreck, or a sunken container. But when the winches pulled the nets to the surface, they revealed something that silenced everyone on deck. Among the fish and seaweed were enormous, curved tusks, yellowed, rough, and crusted with barnacles. They weren't whale bones. They were too thick, too old, too wrong. The men stared at them in uneasy silence. No one spoke for a long time. The sea had given them something ancient, something it wasn't ready to let go of. In the months that followed, more strange catches surfaced from those same waters. Fishermen across the coasts of Britain, Denmark, and the Netherlands began pulling up bones unlike anything that lived in the modern ocean. Some were the size of oars, others, massive jaws lined with blunt teeth. They found animal skulls, vertebrae, even fragments of tools carved from stone. The most disturbing finds were the ones that looked human. Fishermen whispered about skulls tangled in their nets, eye sockets filled with sand and small shells. They told stories of wooden stakes emerging from the seabed, ancient posts blackened by time, as if marking the boundary of something that no longer existed. The local harbors grew tense with rumor. Crews began calling certain stretches of the North Sea the bone grounds. They avoided those waters, claiming that every time their nets touched those coordinates, something strange happened. The legends grew darker. Some fishermen swore that when their nets dragged across the seabed, they could hear faint moaning from below, sounds that seemed to vibrate through the hull. Others claimed the sea hummed at night when they crossed those areas, as if alive. They said the hum wasn't wind or machinery, it was something else. A voice, an echo, warnings from a world buried beneath the waves. In small coastal villages, the stories became superstition. When a boat brought up bones or ancient tools, the items were sometimes reburied in churchyards or quietly thrown back into the sea. People called them cursed objects. Disturbing them, they said, brought storms and bad luck. The fishermen who ignored those warnings often found their boats caught in sudden tempests or their engines failing mid-sea. One captain in Whitby swore that after hauling up a tusk the length of his arm, his compass spun wildly for days. The more they pulled from the deep, the more it seemed like the sea was guarding a secret and punishing anyone who disturbed it. For decades, these artifacts circulated quietly. Bones displayed in taverns, tools sold to collectors, a few kept in dusty drawers of local museums. Nobody could explain how mammoth tusks, giant cattle bones, or Stone Age spears ended up buried under the sea. But eventually word reached scientists. Teams of archaeologists and geologists began to study the fishermen's finds. Under microscopes, they saw what the villagers had missed: small parallel cuts etched into bone. These weren't natural fractures or damage from nets. They were marks made by blades, stone tools sharpened thousands of years ago. The bones came from animals long extinct: mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and ancient cattle called aurochs. The stone tools matched the design of prehistoric European weapons. When they dated the samples using radiocarbon analysis, the results stunned them. The bones were between 8,000 and 10,000 years old. That meant the tools and animals came from a time before the North Sea existed as we know it. This discovery forced a single, impossible question. If these tools were made by humans, then who had lived beneath the sea? The deeper scientists looked, the stranger it became. Historians knew that after the last ice age, sea levels had risen dramatically as glaciers melted. But they never suspected that an entire world, an inhabited world, might be hiding beneath the waves. As the idea spread, new nicknames emerged for the mysterious seabed. Some called it the drowned plains. Others whispered of the lost country, but one name stuck above all others: Doggerland. At first, it was just a term used by fishing crews and oil surveyors drawn from Dogger Bank, a shallow region of the North Sea. But as more evidence emerged, Doggerland became something far greater. It was not just a myth or a lost village. It was a continent, a Stone Age heartland that had once connected Britain to mainland Europe, and it had vanished beneath the rising tides. For the people who fished those waters, this revelation was both thrilling and terrifying. The bones and artifacts they'd found weren't the remnants of wrecks or lost ships. They were the bones of a lost civilization, people who had once walked the plains that now lay 30 meters underwater. Yet with every discovery, unease grew. One trawler captain from Lowestoft claimed that after bringing up a jawbone the size of a small boat, strange things began happening aboard his vessel. His crew heard whispers during foggy nights, as if voices drifted up through the water. The radio crackled with static even on clear days. Once, when they passed over a particular set of coordinates, the depth sounder failed completely. The captain stopped fishing those grounds forever. Another crew from Denmark reported nets so heavy they bent their steel frames, only to rise filled with black mud and broken stakes, some carved to sharp points like ancient spears. They described a stench rising from the muck, like wet earth that had never seen the sun. The locals started calling those patches the drowned fields. When archaeologists began collecting artifacts for study, they noticed a pattern. The finds weren't scattered randomly. They clustered in specific areas of the North Sea, areas that seemed to trace ancient valleys and rivers. It was as if someone had mapped invisible cities across the seabed. But those were questions for later. For now, only the fishermen understood what it meant to touch that hidden world. To them, the sea was alive. It breathed, groaned, and whispered. It could take lives and return ghosts. As news spread through Europe, scientists, divers, and explorers rushed to learn more. But even they could not escape the eerie feeling that the sea was guarding its own history, that whatever Doggerland had been, it was not eager to be rediscovered. In pubs and ports along Britain's eastern coast, old sailors told the story differently. They said that when the last great flood came, it drowned more than land. It drowned memory. It drowned names. It drowned the light of a people who once walked between the islands. And every time a net drags across the seabed, it disturbs that memory again. When the sea hums, they say, it isn't wind or pressure. It's the echo of their last night, the moment the water came for them. For centuries, these tales were dismissed as seafarers' superstition. But the bones told another story. They were real. They were ancient. And they were human. The evidence was building toward something no one was ready to face. The North Sea was not a graveyard of ships. It was a graveyard of civilization, and what the fishermen had found was only the beginning. Because when the oil companies arrived with their deep sea scanners and sonar arrays, the truth beneath the waves would begin to surface, and it would terrify even the scientists who uncovered it. Ghost landscapes beneath the sea, the maps that shouldn't exist. The mystery might have stayed a fisherman's tale forever. Old bones, bad luck, and stories told over pints in smoky harbors, if not for an accident that began far from archaeology. In the 1960s, oil companies came to the North Sea chasing another kind of buried treasure. They weren't looking for mammoths or ancient tools. They were looking for fuel, black gold, trapped deep beneath the seabed. Their ships were equipped with a new technology that promised to reveal the ocean's hidden geology: seismic scanning. The method was simple in theory, but revolutionary in practice. The vessels fired pulses of sound into the seabed, huge bursts of energy that traveled through layers of mud and rock. When the echoes bounced back, they were recorded by sensitive microphones trailing behind the ship. By measuring how fast those echoes returned, engineers could build a rough picture of what lay below. At first, it seemed like routine work. The readouts showed what everyone expected: thick slabs of clay, sand, limestone, and shale. But as the scans accumulated, something began to appear in the data that no one could explain. Across several different maps, patterns emerged. They weren't chaotic or random. They looked designed. Instead of the usual curves and faults that marked natural geology, the echoes formed distinct shapes. Long, sinuous lines branching and rejoining, spreading out like veins. In some areas, they widened into open spaces, then tapered off again, repeating over and over. To an oil geologist, it didn't look like a gas deposit. It looked like a river, and there were dozens of them. Each survey from a different company, Shell, BP, Esso, came back with the same strange formations, all stretching across the central North Sea. The lines curved and forked exactly as real river systems do when they cut through land. But these rivers were hundreds of feet below the seabed, trapped in solid sediment far deeper than any living water could flow. At first, the engineers blamed the equipment. They thought the scanners were glitching, that the vibrations of waves or ship engines were distorting the readings. But when the scans were rerun, the lines appeared again, identical to before. Something buried beneath the sea was giving back echoes shaped like a world that shouldn't exist. The discoveries caused quiet ripples inside the energy companies, but no one outside knew. These maps were classified as proprietary data, owned by corporations, not universities. To the oil executives, they were geological noise, not profit, not worth explaining. But a few of the technicians couldn't let it go. They started talking to academic geologists, slipping copies of the old survey strips to researchers who might understand them. In 1973, a small group of British scientists gathered in a basement lab at the University of Birmingham. They unrolled the seismic charts across the floor and stared at them for hours. The lines were unmistakable. They were valleys, floodplains, even ancient deltas. The seabed wasn't just a mess of sediment. It was the fossilized surface of an entire drowned continent. One of the researchers, a young geologist named Dr. Bryony Coles, later described the moment. It was like seeing a ghost landscape come back to life. The rivers, the ridges, they were all still there, perfectly preserved, just sleeping under the sea. They called it the Paleo, sea floor, but the name Doggerland soon took hold again. The same name fishermen had whispered for generations. In the 1980s, as more oil surveys expanded, the data grew impossible to ignore. Maps from British, Danish, and Dutch waters all showed the same thing. Valleys meeting in the center of the North Sea like arteries converging on a heart. When those rivers were traced backward, they led not into the sea but onto what was now dry land, the coastlines of England, Belgium, Germany, and Denmark. It was as if all of northern Europe had once been one continuous plain. Still, many scientists were skeptical. The seismic maps were never meant for archaeology. They were low-resolution, distorted by sound waves and tide movement. To some, claiming they revealed a lost world, felt like fantasy. But then came the proof no one could deny, the link between the maps and the bones. Archaeologists compared the coordinates of trawler discoveries, the mammoth tusks, the stone tools, the carved stakes, against the geological data. The overlap was perfect. Every major artifact recovery lined up with one of the ancient valleys on the maps. These valleys, they realized, were once rivers flowing through grasslands. The fishermen weren't pulling up random debris. They were dragging their nets through what used to be the riverbeds of a vanished world. As the evidence mounted, researchers began piecing together what Doggerland must have looked like before it drowned. Imagine a landscape stretching from what is now eastern England all the way to Denmark and the Netherlands. A vast expanse of rolling plains, rivers, and forests. To the north rose icy mountains. To the south, temperate meadows and wetlands teeming with life. This was Europe's great heartland, a corridor of migration for both humans and animals during the Stone Age. And then, one day, it was gone. By the late 1980s, the theory had solidified. Doggerland wasn't myth or legend. It had been real. A place where Stone Age hunters built camps, followed herds, and fished in rivers that no longer exist. To prove it, scientists needed more than maps. They needed physical samples from below the seabed. That meant drilling. Expeditions were launched from the coasts of Britain and Denmark. Using long coring tubes, researchers extracted narrow cylinders of sediment from the ocean floor. Each layer told a story. One band of brown peat, then gray sand, then marine clay. The deeper they drilled, the older the world became. At the bottom of some cores, buried beneath meters of ocean mud, they found what should have been impossible soil. Real, dry, fertile earth, preserved from a time when that patch of seabed was still land. In that ancient soil were the remains of plants, pollen from birch trees, hazelnuts, grasses, microscopic life that once bloomed in sunlight and rain. This was no random geological fluke. It was a snapshot of a living ecosystem now drowned in darkness. As word spread through scientific circles, Doggerland became a sensation. The newspapers called it Europe's Atlantis. The term made archaeologists cringe, but they couldn't deny the public fascination. For the first time, the world began to understand that the sea floor was not dead ground. It was a museum of lost worlds. But beneath the excitement, there was unease, because even as the maps revealed plains and rivers, they also showed something else: scars. Long gouges and channels cut through the ancient terrain, as if torn apart by unimaginable force. In some regions, the landscape ended abruptly, broken off like shattered glass. What could cause destruction on such a scale? Was it slow erosion from the rising sea, or a single catastrophic event that tore Doggerland apart in days? The oil engineers didn't care, but the archaeologists did. The next phase of research would turn Doggerland from an academic curiosity into one of the greatest geological mysteries on Earth. Because when they began to model the environmental history of the North Sea, they realized something chilling. The people who once lived there didn't vanish peacefully, they drowned. It wasn't one flood, it was dozens. Slow at first, invisible, generational. Each year, the waters crept a little higher. Families moved inland, leaving their fire pits and tools behind. But then, one day, the ocean rose faster than they could run. By the time it was over, everything, their homes, their animals, their lives, lay beneath the water. The world above forgot them, but the sea remembered. And centuries later, when the fishermen dragged their nets across the bone grounds, the sea began to whisper their story again. A story of land reclaimed by water, and of what still lies buried beneath the waves. The drowning of a continent, when the sea took the world. The story of Doggerland's end begins with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that comes when an entire world begins to disappear. For thousands of years, this lost country had been a paradise of green plains, slow rivers, and open skies. It was a place where wild herds grazed, where hunters followed the seasons, and families built camps near shallow lakes that mirrored the clouds. The people who lived there knew the land as home. They carved tools from bone, hunted elk and reindeer, gathered nuts and roots, and fished in the cool rivers that cut through what is now the bottom of the North Sea. They couldn't have imagined that beneath their feet, the world itself was shifting. At the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 years ago, the great glaciers that had buried northern Europe began to melt. They had towered over the landscape for tens of thousands of years, holding the planet in a deep freeze. But now something was changing. The sun grew warmer, the ice cracked and roared. Trillions of tons of frozen water began to pour into the oceans. It didn't happen in a single moment. It took centuries. But for the people of Doggerland, it must have felt relentless. The rivers grew wider. The lowlands became marshes. Hills turned to islands. What had once been solid ground turned to mud beneath their feet. At first, the change was slow enough to ignore. A generation could grow up in one village, only to watch the shoreline move a few hundred meters closer each year. But the signs were everywhere. The sound of waves where there should have been grass, salt creeping into the drinking water, fish that swam where once there were trees. The sea was coming for them. Sediment cores taken from the North Sea floor today tell the story in layers. Bands of dark peat, Ancient soil from forests and meadows lie buried beneath thick deposits of sand and clay. Each layer marks a moment when the land sank a little deeper, drowned a little more. Pollen analysis shows how freshwater plants disappeared and saltwater species took their place. The transformation was total and unstoppable. Scientists estimate that global sea levels rose over 100 meters after the last ice age. Every coastline on Earth moved. But for Doggerland, the change was personal. The North Sea basin, once a wide, low plain, became a trap. The flooding didn't just come from one side. It came from all around. The Atlantic pushed in from the west. The North Sea surged from the north. And from the south, the English Channel slowly swallowed the last land bridge that connected Britain to Europe. By 7000 BCE, the first waves were already washing over the heart of Doggerland. The people moved uphill, abandoning the old hunting grounds for higher ridges. The Dogger Bank, the raised plateau that still lies beneath the sea today, became one of the last refuges. It was a narrow ridge of dry land, surrounded by shallows and salt marshes. To the west, Britain's new coastlines began to form. To the east, the sea advanced through Denmark and the Netherlands. Those who lived on the ridge must have seen the water rise every year, the world shrinking around them. The archaeologists studying this period can trace the desperation in the evidence. Stone tools became smaller, made for fishing and trapping rather than for hunting large game. Harpoons carved from antler appear in the record, designed to catch seals and fish rather than elk or deer. People who had once roamed great plains were now confined to the edges of the encroaching sea, adapting as their world sank. But even adaptation has its limits. Freshwater sources grew brackish and undrinkable. Crops failed. Diseases spread in the stagnant marshes. Families packed their belongings, simple bags of woven reeds, spears, bone needles, and moved west toward higher ground. Everywhere they went, the sea followed. For centuries, the people of Doggerland retreated step by step. But the final blow didn't come from slow rising tides. It came from a single, apocalyptic event, the Storega Slide. About 200 years ago, off the coast of Norway, a massive section of the continental shelf collapsed. It was one of the largest underwater landslides in human history. Nearly 3,000 cubic kilometers of rock, mud, and sediment suddenly gave way, plunging into the deep Atlantic trench. The result was a tsunami unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Waves up to 20 meters high roared outward across the North Atlantic, smashing into Norway, Scotland, and the Shetland Islands. And in their path lay what remained of Doggerland. The ocean that had been creeping in for centuries now came all at once. Modern marine geology confirms the devastation. Beneath layers of seabed mud, scientists have found bands of coarse sand and gravel, tightly packed and out of place, evidence of violent flooding. These tsunami layers mark the day the ocean struck. Entire forests were uprooted. Animals were swept away. The few high ridges where humans might have survived the slow rise were obliterated by waves. In hours, what centuries of rising seas had not yet claimed was gone. Imagine the view from one of the last dry hills. You wake to the sound of wind. The horizon is a gray line of water. The rivers you once followed as a child now stretch into the sea. The air smells of salt and rotting grass. Then the wind changes. It comes not as a breeze, but as a scream, a low thunder building from beyond the horizon. The ground begins to tremble. Birds rise in a sudden black cloud, scattering inland. The wave appears like a moving wall, swallowing everything in its path. Trees, animals, fires, voices. You run. There is nowhere to go. By nightfall, the ridge is gone. The plains are gone. The land is gone. When the waters finally calmed, the world had changed forever. Doggerland was now the North Sea. Only a few islands remained, and within generations, even those would disappear beneath the waves. The survivors who reached the new coastlines of Britain or Denmark would have looked back across an endless expanse of water, knowing that their home was somewhere out there, buried beneath the sea. For them, the memory of that flood would not fade. Their descendants told stories of the world that drowned, of the roaring waves and the day the sea rose to swallow the sun. For thousands of years, those stories were passed down around fires and through generations, transforming into myth. The Great Flood became legend. Across cultures, echoes of Doggerland's end appear again and again. The deluge of Noah, the flood of Deucalion, the sinking of Atlantis. Tales of divine punishment, of worlds washed clean, of survival and loss. Perhaps they all began here on a land that truly did drown. Archaeologists now understand that the people of Doggerland weren't destroyed in one instant. They fought for centuries, adapting, rebuilding, migrating. But the Storegga tsunami was the final blow that erased the last traces of their world. Afterward, the sea continued to rise for another 1,000 years, sealing the evidence beneath hundreds of feet of silt and sand. For nearly 9 millennia, Doggerland lay hidden in darkness, its forests turned to peat, its rivers fossilized in stone, its people forgotten, until, by accident, fishermen began to drag up their bones again. Today, when you sail across the North Sea, you're gliding over the rooftops of an ancient country. Beneath the waves lie the ghosts of rivers, the shadows of valleys, and the silence of a world that once breathed air. Every echo of sonar, every net that rises heavy with bones, is a reminder that the ocean remembers everything it takes. Doggerland was not the first civilization to drown, and it will not be the last, because what happened there 8,000 years ago was not just a tragedy of the past, it was a warning. Resurrecting the lost world, the warning beneath the waves. For thousands of years, Doggerland slept beneath the sea, silent, untouched, its valleys packed with silt, its rivers turned to sand. But the ocean does not keep secrets forever. When technology finally reached deep enough to listen, the drowned world began to speak again. It started quietly, almost accidentally. Oil and gas companies had gathered seismic data across the North Sea for decades. Massive archives of sound waves bouncing through rock, forgotten on hard drives and dusty reels. In the 1990s, a few archaeologists realized that buried in that industrial data was something extraordinary, a way to see into the past. Led by Dr. Vincent Gaffney, a team of researchers began piecing together the puzzle. They had a simple question. What did the world look like before the flood? But answering it required supercomputers powerful enough to process trillions of seismic echoes. It took years of coding, filtering, and reconstruction. Each sound wave was a faint reflection from layers of mud and stone, a whisper from the ancient land beneath the sea. When the first 3D maps appeared on their screens, the researchers fell silent. There it was, an entire continent, perfectly preserved beneath the waves. Rolling hills stretched across the digital seafloor,